front, it starts where this little triangular inset is. So it's open between where the triangular inset is. And it goes all the way around the front waist seam. And then instead of continuing along the back waist seam, it extends down that little triangular yoke seam, and then it continues down the center back. So this is all one piece, this cascade that's happening back here. All one piece. And it goes from the bottom of the hem up around the yoke seam and wraps around to the front. And I was just baffled by that. What is that going to be? You know, I thought maybe this is something that you'd have to drape. And as I laid this dress out another way, it's exactly a circle. Check this out. We open that up. You see this? Mm-hmm. It's just a circle. Cool. And the width, I mean, this is kind of floppy fabric and it's stretching out where it's on the bias, but the width is consistent all the way around. And so when it's going around the body, it looks like a little flounce, and when it's going vertically down the center back, it's doing this great cascade. Okay, so we're going to be drafting a circle, which will be a review for most of you if you've taken 1A recently. So it's basically the bottom of the 1A skirt, but then at the very bottom, so this is, imagine this goes here, and then it kind of wraps around. At the very bottom, where the cascade ends, we're going to curve off the end so that we don't have an extra corner there. There won't be anything here. This will just get sewn to the center back seam, and it'll look
So
nice.
we're leaving that corner, like
We're lopping the corner off. So there is a corner at the front because it's making kind of a little
that hits
skirt
the bottom
opening.
of the center back seam.
Yes.
But the other side will
So
just
this
curve
hits
away.
the center back seam, and then
Okay.
we're just lopping that off. But we're just going to start off with a circle. So there's a chart on page 290 that lets us know how big to make the radius of our circle. But we need to know the circumference. We need to know the inside edge measurement in order to figure out what radius we need to do. So this inner edge is the part that's getting sewn to the skirt, and we need to measure our skirt pieces to know how big that needs to be. And then once we know that size, we can look at the chart and see what radius we need to use. Okay, so the measurements we need, this one, this one, we need a front piece. Okay. So let's start from the center back. I know I want this cascade to go all the way down to the bottom. Okay, and remember we didn't have hem allowance here. It's just going to be flush. So we're going to measure from the bottom of this all the way up to the seam allowance intersection here. We don't need to add seam allowance to this flounce in this area because that'll get sewn on after that seam is closed.
And this is the depth of the circle skirt?
No, this is we're adding up all the measurements, but this is getting sewn around to come up with this inside circular edge measurement. So I need a few measurements. And I'm just going to write them down on the pieces as I find them. Well, I remember that was 12 inches on purpose. And if I had written it down, I wouldn't have had to measure it, right? Then I've got this little measurement. 3 inches. So I'm going to start a tally. Okay, 12 inches plus 3 inches. So all the center back seam, and then I'm going to turn the corner and go along that diagonal angle. Just make sure you're not including seam allowance. You remember I've got 1/2 inch here and 1/2 inch there. I'm measuring just the seam line. So then I've got 9 3/8. And depending, like your angles might be a little bit different, so your numbers might be a little bit different, and it's not that big of a deal. So that takes care of 1, 2, 3 sections. Now I need the front.
We gotta measure that or something.
So now this one, since I traced off an existing flare skirt pattern, I don't have a seam line to measure along. Make sure you're not measuring along the cut edge. So if you need a seam line to follow, it's sort of like reverse engineering seam allowance. I would go and I would mark a 1/2 inch line so you have something to measure. And we need to know where this flounce ends. Okay, so we know by looking at that dress that it ends where the triangle begins up here, and we haven't drafted that. But I measured the triangle last night, and that triangle from the center front to wherever it ends is 2 3/8. So I'm going to measure over 2 3/8, put a little mark, and I'm actually going to put a notch now on this pattern. So when it's time to sew that cascade in, or that little peplum in, I know I'm going to place it at that notch. So some of you had seen my old practice pattern. I had a notch, but it wasn't at the princess seam. That's what that notch is. That's showing the cascades coming around, and needing to end there. It's also saying when I sew the bodice to it, the triangle is going to end there. Okay? So I'm going to measure from my little 2 3/8 inch, my 2 3/8 inch space along the waistline seam to my seam allowance at my side seam. So I need to kind of know where that side seam intersection is. Okay. And I can, if I hold my ruler like this, I can bend it along a curve pretty easily. So I'm getting 4 7/8. Okay, so if I add this up, I've got some eighths to add up. So I have 7/8 plus 3/8 is 10/8. I've got 12, 5, 14, 15, 16, 18, 28, and 10/8, which is what, 29, and 2/8, which is 29 1/4. Okay, so my measurement that I need to accomplish to get that cascade to wrap around is 29 1/4. Well, if we look at this, let's say this is the straight grain, okay? That means this is the straight grain down here. That means this is a cross grain, and this is a cross grain, and those are really stable, right? Here, this is a bias, and 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 this is a bias. So I've got really stable areas where my folds are, and I've got really stretchy areas where my folds aren't. So this seam line, when I go to pin it and sew it, will stretch. And I need to account for that, because if I made this inner seam 29 1/4 and I actually go to start sewing, it's going to grow as we sew. So for a full circle, we're going to be eliminating, let me double check, 1 inch. Yeah, we're going to eliminate 1 inch for stretch. So instead of 29 1/4, I'm going to take that and I'm going to minus 1 inch.
Is that a rule for circles?
Yeah, and the more circles you have, the more you eliminate, and it kind of has to do with the size of the circles too. Like I wouldn't, if you're making a teeny tiny little one, I wouldn't take a whole inch away. So it's just sort of a general for a full circle skirt that 1 inch will do it, but I would test it. Yeah. Okay, so 1 inch for stretch, and that's going to leave me with 28 1/4. Okay, so that's my goal measurement for that inside circle. Now sometimes if you're doing a circle skirt, depending on what you want to do, there are all these different variations on page 28. It shows you, like the circle could be the whole skirt, or you could put a whole circle in the front and a whole circle in the back, and it would make it really, really flippy. You could do a half of a circle and it would look more like an A-line. In those cases, there would be seams. You would have side seams or center back and center front seams, and you would have to include that seam allowance in here.
When you're sewing it, can you stay stitch it?
Yes,
Will it
absolutely.
take care of that inch or not? Even stay stitching, you want to
You would stay stitch it anyway, because you're going to need to clip the curve, but as you stay stitch it, sometimes will stretch it too. Yeah, and you may